Hey there. Tonight we begin under an Australian sky. And if you were standing here with me, far from the nearest city, with the earth breathing out the cold it stored all day, you would probably count the little cluster above the horizon once, then count it again, and then narrow your eyes and feel that small old confusion. There are 6 lights there for most of us. 6 clear points, close together, trembling in the dark. And yet for a very long time, across Aboriginal Australia, people have remembered them as 7 sisters. Not 6. 7. As if the sky itself once carried one more bright body, and memory refused to let her go. That is where our story begins. Not in a library first, not in a museum case, not even in Greece where many modern listeners first meet these stars, but here, on country, under a night that feels older than speech, where the 7 sisters are part of dreaming, part of ancestral memory, part of song, ritual, movement, warning, and return. And the darker truth, waiting quietly underneath it, is this. Sometimes, the oldest stories are not built around what people can still see. They are built around what has gone missing, what keeps being chased, what nearly disappears, and what a culture refuses to forget. Tonight we will follow those sisters across the Australian sky, through frost on the ground, through songs carried across generations, through old pursuit, old danger, and the strange ache of a missing light. We will sit with a story that may preserve one of the deepest sky memories human beings still carry. And if that sounds like your kind of night, do leave a like, subscribe, and settle in with me by the fire. There is something very old waiting above us, and it has been patient for a very long time. Now let the room soften. Let the shoulders fall a little. Unclench the jaw. Let the breath come in slowly, then leave just as slowly. Imagine the firelight, low and golden. Imagine the candle beside us, bending slightly in the draft. Imagine the sound of distant night insects, or perhaps only the hush that comes when the world has finally stopped asking anything of you. Above us, the Australian sky is turning clear and black, and the stars are beginning to stand out one by one. There is a particular quality to the night sky over much of Australia that makes it feel not empty, but inhabited. The darkness is wide. Yes, but it is also close. It presses softly against the skin. The land lies quiet under it, though not truly silent. Somewhere there is the dry rasp of grass against itself. Somewhere the faint movement of a bird changing its place in a tree. Somewhere the earth still holds the memory of heat, while the air has already slipped into cold. If you were here in late winter, before dawn, you might even see frost laid over the ground in a delicate pale skin, as though the stars had lowered themselves during the night and rested just above the soil. And there, rising together, the little cluster appears. The Pleiades, as the modern astronomical name would have it. A young group of stars, by the standards of the universe, bright and blue and still wrapped in the ghostly dust of their own making. Astronomers can tell us their age in millions of years, can explain nebulae and stellar motion and the long, patient drift of light through space. Useful knowledge. Beautiful knowledge. But tonight, the more human question comes first. When did people begin looking at these stars and feeling that they carried a story? The written record is late. as writing always is when placed beside memory. Chinese astronomical literature mentions the cluster thousands of years ago. Ancient objects in Europe may depict it symbolically. Greek poets would later name and mourn the lost sister. Scholars collect these traces with care, but Aboriginal Australia asks us to think differently about age, because a story does not need ink in order to survive. It needs voices. It needs ceremony. It needs country. It needs people who know when the stars return in the season and what their return means on the ground below. That is why dreaming matters so much here. The word is often used too loosely by people outside the cultures it belongs to, as if it simply means a myth or a legend. It is gentler and deeper than that, and more exact. It holds ancestral presence, creation, law, memory, place, the ongoing relationship between land and people, between the sky above and the obligations below. A dreaming story is not only about what happened once, it is also about what continues. It breathes in ritual, in naming, in travel, in the right way to move through a landscape and remember who has already moved through it before you. So when the seven sisters are spoken of in Aboriginal traditions, they are not just decorative figures pinned into the sky for entertainment. They are living memory. They are part of a pattern that stretches between stars and bodies, between women and ceremony, between season and survival. In many traditions, they are young women, sisters, beautiful, bright, sometimes associated with shining skin, long hair, frost, cold, or water, and nearby, often close enough in the sky to make the shape of the story plain even before anyone speaks, are the pursuing male figures, linked in many traditions with what Western astronomy calls Orion. You know that feeling when you look at the night sky and suddenly realize that older people were not simply naming stars at random. They were seeing motion, tension, character. They were watching the cluster rise, watching Orion follow. And from that movement, a story began to tighten. In Australia, the tightening did not become a casual bedtime fable. It became part of ceremonial life, part of the memory of first people moving across the continent, naming places, laying down songs, and teaching those who came after them how to recognize what the sky was saying. The source material for this episode mentions one version told among the Biami-related traditions of Eastern Australia, in which the sisters are known as the Miame, or a similar local form, depending on transcription and language context. In that telling, they are 7 beautiful sisters with radiant bodies made of ice. I have always found that image wonderfully strange. Bodies made of ice in Australia, not because the continent cannot know cold, it certainly can, but because the image carries the feeling of fragile brilliance, of beauty that glows and can also melt away. It is exactly the sort of image a very old sky story should have. These sisters are followed by a group of young men who leave gifts, often honey, because they are skilled at finding hives. It is a detail I love because it makes the whole story feel human before it feels cosmic. Honey is not abstract. Honey is sticky fingers, smoke near the hive, the hum of disturbed bees, the sweetness of something earned the difficult way. The men leave these gifts for the sisters. The sisters appreciate the gifts, but they do not yield. Desire and refusal enter the story very early. So does persistence. so does danger. In another turn of the old telling, an ancestral fire figure, old and potent, and not entirely safe, takes two of the girls. Fire enters where frost was already present. Heat touches what was cold and shining. Their icy brightness begins to melt, and in the logic of the story, this melting also robs the old fire being of his power. It is such a vivid image, almost dreamlike in the most precise sense. Fire kidnapping ice. Heat undone by the very thing it tried to possess. Even old stories know irony, and sometimes they deliver it more elegantly than any modern writer. There is a quiet lesson there about taking what was never yours. After this, the girls are placed in the sky. Their brightness is not exactly what it once was, and over time the others join them there. The pursuing males also let themselves die for love in some variants and become the stars of Orion's belt, continuing the old pattern above. Even now, when people look up, they can still feel the pursuit without needing anyone to point it out for them. The stars do that work with their positions alone. One cluster ahead. The line of hunters following behind. The sky remembers tension very efficiently. What makes the Aboriginal Seven Sisters traditions especially powerful is that they are not only about pursuit in the heavens. They are tied to ritual on Earth. When the cluster appears in the eastern sky in late winter, frost may cover the ground. Children or older youths go out to scrape the frost from the earth and rub it over their bodies. This is part of ceremony, part of coming of age, part of the old relation between the sisters above and the people below. The cold touch of frost becomes a kind of blessing, or at least a test, and there is a warning woven into it. If sunlight touches the frost-covered body too soon, weakness may follow. The ritual asks for attention, timing, discipline. Like most old ceremonial acts, it links the body to the sky by way of season. Sit with that for a moment. Dawn not yet broken. Frost laid over the ground. Children breathing clouds into the cold air. Elders watching. Hands gathering the pale skin of night from stone and soil, then pressing it to arms, shoulders, chest. Somewhere above, the seven sisters, still visible in the thinning darkness. It is not just a story being remembered. It is a story being entered. Across Aboriginal Australia, the names differ. The details differ. Country is not one flat field, and culture is not one voice. South Australia holds one form, New South Wales another, Western Australia another again, Victoria yet another. The sisters may be called by different names. Their pursuers may have different local identities. Water may appear as frost, or ice, or rain, or another related element. Yet the broad shape remains astonishingly steady. The Pleiades are women, often sisters. Orion or nearby male stars become pursuers, hunters, or men. The sky becomes a place where pursuit never quite ends, and where transformation offers protection that is real, but not completely restful. Honestly, I have always found it strange that modern people so often treat these old sky traditions as if they were vague, dreamy things, loose and decorative, when they are often remarkably observant. They notice position. They notice recurrence. They notice season. They notice that the body can be trained to remember what the eye sees They notice that one small cluster of stars can call whole ceremonies into motion. That is not vagueness. That is attention refined over a very long time. The mystery of the 6 and the 7 sits inside all of this like a small, bright thorn. Because once you have been told that the cluster is the 7 sisters, you can never look at it innocently again. You count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Then you search the darkness for the absent one. Maybe your eyesight is poor. Maybe the night is not dark enough. Maybe cloud is thinning the edge of the cluster. Or maybe, more unsettlingly, the story is remembering something your eyes no longer can. A missing sister. A hidden one. One taken. Faded. Ashamed. Dead. Or simply too dim to stand apart now. The specific explanation changes from culture to culture, but the pattern remains so stubborn that it begins to feel less like invention and more like witness. That is what pulls so many people into this story. Not just the pursuit, not just the beauty, not even just the antiquity. It is the feeling that human beings may be carrying a memory of the sky from a time when the sky itself looks slightly different. We are not ready to prove that yet. Not tonight. Not this early in the tale. For now, it is enough to stand on country and feel how old the looking is. To understand that for Aboriginal Australians, these stars are not an imported puzzle or a decorative cluster with a convenient Greek label. They are ancestral women in the sky. They are ceremony. They are danger and refusal. They are frost on the ground. They are a memory held by people whose connection to this continent reaches back into astonishing depth. And that means that before we compare anything, before we let Greece or astronomy or migration theory step in, we need to stay here a little longer. We need to let the Australian night do its work. The cluster is still rising. The cold is still gathering on the earth. The sisters are still just ahead of those who follow them. And if we listen closely enough, the old dreaming story begins to move, not as an artifact, but as a living presence carried through voice, body, and sky. If we stay under this Australian sky a little longer, and we should, because old stories dislike being hurried, the 7 sisters begin to feel less like distant lights and more like people moving through country. That is one of the great strengths of Aboriginal traditions. The sky is never fully detached from the ground below it. The stars are not cold abstractions pinned into an empty map. They belong to movement, season, ceremony, warning, kinship, and land. So when we follow the sisters, we are not only looking upward, we are also walking softly over earth that remembers them. Across Aboriginal Australia, the names of the sisters change from place to place. Because country changes, language changes, and no one living tradition can be used to flatten all the others. This matters. It matters because respect begins by allowing difference to remain visible. In some communities, the sisters are remembered under one name, in others under another, and the forms of the story bend around local landscapes, local law, local ceremonial life. Yet the old pattern returns with enough consistency to feel like the turning of a familiar object in the hand. Women in the sky, men, hunters, or pursuers nearby. Danger, evasion, transformation. Water in one form or another. The stars above speaking to the life below. The source transcript names several examples. Among the Adnyamathanha of South Australia, the sisters bear one name. In the north of New South Wales, a different people remember them differently. In Western Australia, another form again. In Victoria, another still. Each community has its own relationship to the stars. And if you were sitting with elders on country, the story would not feel like a museum summary. It would feel placed. This hill, that waterhole, this season, that line in the sky at dusk, that ritual time, that ancestral movement across this exact earth. Stories gain weight when they belong somewhere specific. I think people from outside Australia sometimes miss that. They hear that the same star cluster appears in many traditions, and they imagine a floating universal myth with no roots. But the opposite is truer here. The story survives because it is rooted. It clings to springs, ridges, pathways, camps, ceremony grounds, the first chill of certain mornings, the reappearance of certain stars above certain horizons. It is not generalized. It is grounded. If you were walking country in the dim blue before dawn with someone who knows the old story, they might not begin by speaking at all. They might simply show you where the frost lies more thickly, or where the spring holds cold longer than the surrounding earth, or where a line of song meets a line of stars. The teaching would arrive quietly, and because of that it would stay with you. This is one reason oral traditions can endure so powerfully. They are not only heard, they are inhabited. They are walked. Water belongs to the sisters in many tellings, and not always in the same way. Sometimes it is frost, sometimes ice, sometimes rain, sometimes a more general association with cold shining moisture and the life carried in it. This is worth noticing because water in Australia is never casual. It is treasure, root, memory, danger, promise. To connect the sisters with forms of water is to wrap them in one of the deepest realities of the continent. They are not only beautiful young women, they are part of the old rhythm by which the land itself is read. Imagine the frost ceremony again, but more slowly this time. The night has thinned toward morning, though the sun has not yet shown its edge. The earth is silvered. Not everywhere, perhaps, but enough that the ground seems dusted with quiet light. Children and older youths come with elders toward the spring. Their feet darken the frosted grass or hard soil as they move. Breath leaves each mouth in pale bursts. The air feels clean enough to ring if it were struck. Hands bend down. Frost is scraped gently from the ground, from stone, from the places where the cold has gathered and held. It is rubbed over the skin. The body tightens at the touch. The cold bites, then settles. No one laughs too loudly. It is a ceremony, not a game, even if somewhere a child wants badly to squirm. Above them, the sisters still hang in the sky. There is something almost unbearably beautiful about that. The stars above, the frost below, the body held between them. A child entering adulthood under the witness of ancestral women in the heavens. This is what I mean when I say the sky is not detached. It presses into life. It gives time to the body. It tells people when the world has turned to a certain point again. And there is the warning. If sunlight strikes the frost-covered body too soon, weakness may follow. To a modern listener, that can sound merely symbolic. But symbols do not become less powerful because they are practical. The ritual asks for timing, passions, careful movement. The child must be protected within the right span of dawn. Light itself becomes part of the test. The lesson is embodied. Not everything bright is gentle. Not every morning can be entered carelessly. Some things must be done in their proper order or strength drains away. Old stories are very good at placing danger inside beauty. The Seven Sisters traditions do this again and again. The sisters are radiant, but their brightness does not protect them from pursuit. Gifts may be offered, but gifts do not cancel threat. The sky is beautiful, but it also records an old tension that never quite resolves. The same stars that call ceremony into motion also preserve the memory of being chased. That pursuit is one of the oldest emotional motors in the story. In many Aboriginal forms, the pursuers are not one single man exactly in the Greek sense, but a group of men, or a hunter, or male figures represented by Orion or nearby stars. There is variation, but the feeling remains. Desire follows. The sisters keep ahead. The line of Orion in the sky helps the eye read the old tension almost automatically. Once it has been named, it becomes very difficult to unsee. There is the cluster. There are the men behind, night after night, season after season. The pattern repeats. It is easy to understand why this would survive in memory. Human beings are deeply shaped by motion in the sky. We read it before we can explain it. We turn recurrent paths into narrative almost without trying. And in hunting societies, or societies shaped by a long inheritance of hunting imagery, the pursuit motif is emotionally immediate. Something follows something else. Something beautiful is threatened. Distance becomes survival. That movement is as old as fear, and perhaps as old as storytelling itself. Still, the Aboriginal traditions are not thin copies of a generic chase. They carry local ceremonial depth that makes them feel heavier, more rooted, and in a certain sense, more intimate than many later literary versions elsewhere. The source transcript points to this repeatedly. These are dreaming stories connected to when the first humans came across the continent, naming land as they moved, turning movement into story, story into song, and song into memory. Some narratives speak of floods, fire, strange lights, and lost places. Others keep the attention tighter on the sisters, on women, on pursuit, on ceremony, on the cold touch of the season when they rise. In each case, the story is tied to continuity of culture, not simply to entertainment. That continuity is astonishing when you pause over it. Human beings reaching Australia tens of thousands of years ago, dispersing across vast distances, developing regional traditions and languages, yet still preserving sky stories of great age with extraordinary care. I have always found that far more moving than the modern hunger to stamp a single neat age on everything. Sometimes a story's age is felt less in a number than in its texture. It has been handled a long time. It has been spoken in many mouths. It fits the stars too well. It fits the land too well. It has the smoothness of something carried for generations. The Greek comparison will matter later, but for now, it helps to resist it. Because once Greece enters the room, modern audiences have a bad habit of treating the Aboriginal story as if it were the cousin of the classical one, rather than the other way around. We should reverse the balance tonight. Here, the Australian story comes first. Here, Orion is not yet the famous giant hunter from Mediterranean myth. He is first what the Australian sky allows him to become: a pursuing male presence, a line of men, hunters, those who follow and desire and keep moving beneath the sisters' path. This matters because it changes how we feel the stars. In the Greek story, which we will visit later, the emotional register leans toward pursuit, divine intervention, and celestial continuation. In Aboriginal Australia, the story is woven more tightly into ceremony, body, season, and place. The same sky becomes a different moral and emotional landscape. This is not a small difference. It may even be one reason the Australian traditions feel so ancient. They are not just about what happened in the sky once. They are instructions for how to live under that sky now. You can hear that in the handling of water imagery, frost on the ground, the cold, the warning about sunlight, the brilliance of icy bodies, the occasional links to rain. These are not random ornaments. They bind the sisters to earthly cycles. The old Australians who told these stories were not detached stargazers standing outside nature like patient academics in good boots. They were readers of interlocking signs: sky, weather, season, body, ceremony. The stars mattered because they spoke into life. And then there is the number. 7. The number itself has a soft pressure to it. 7 sisters. The name feels balanced in the mouth. Complete. Memorable. Yet the eye resists it. 6 is what most people see. 6 definite stars, with perhaps a 7th if the sky is very dark and the eye is kind, or perhaps not. And still the traditions insist. 7. The insistence is so widespread, not only in Australia but elsewhere, that it begins to sound like memory arguing with visibility. That is such a fascinating human situation. Really, the story says one thing. The eye says another. Neither gives in. Among Aboriginal traditions, 1 or sometimes 2 of the sisters may be hidden, dead, abducted, or otherwise absent from clear sight. The exact explanation shifts. That flexibility is important because it shows people adapting the missing light into forms that still make emotional sense within their own story worlds. No culture likes an unexplained gap for very long. If one sister cannot be seen, then something happened to her. Story moves in and gives the absence a shape. Not to deceive, but to make memory livable. A hidden sister is sad in a particular way. Not as final as death. Not as simple as departure. Hidden means close but out of reach. Missing but not fully gone. Present in the count. Absent in the eye. It is the perfect emotional condition for an old sky motif. You can feel why it would endure. A cluster with an unresolved number keeps the mind returning to it. It nags. It invites explanation. It asks the same question over and over across generations. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Where is the seventh? If you were lying on your back on cold ground with the fire reduced to embers and someone beside you named the stars one by one, that question might feel almost personal. Perhaps you would decide the seventh was there, just hidden in the brighter knot of the cluster. Perhaps you would imagine her dimmed by shame, as later Greeks would do. Perhaps taken. Perhaps faded. Perhaps too faint now to stand apart. Or perhaps, if you were willing to let the thought deepen, you might wonder whether the old people were not confused at all. Perhaps they were remembering a sky that no longer looks quite the same. Some scholars argue just that, or something near it, though carefully. The astronomical reasoning belongs later in the story, and we will come to it. For now it hovers at the edge like the unseen sister herself. The stars do move. After all, though so slowly that myth may preserve what ordinary history cannot. A cluster may once have looked slightly different to the naked eye. A pair of stars may once have stood farther apart. A memory of 7 could outlive the visibility of 7. It is an extraordinary possibility, but old sky traditions are full of extraordinary possibilities, and the trick is to hold them gently without crushing them into certainty too soon. What we can say already is this. Aboriginal Australia remembers the Seven Sisters with a seriousness that reaches beyond decorative myth. The stories live in many languages, in many communities, in many local forms. They are bound to women, to pursuit, to water, to ceremony, to country, to season, and to the old human act of lifting the face toward the dark and finding ancestors there. That alone makes them precious. And because they are precious, we have to be careful with them. Careful not to treat them as merely evidence for a theory. Careful not to drag them too quickly into someone else's framework. Careful not to smooth out their local textures just because we are tempted by the huge age implied by their sky memory. Respect comes first. Wonder after that. Conclusions, if any. Last of all, the sisters are still above us now. The fire has burned lower. The frost, if it is the right season, is settling again on the ground. Somewhere out there, on country, the stars rise as they always have, and the old story continues to move between sky and earth without needing our permission. Soon we will allow another version of the same heavenly chase to approach from very far away, from the Mediterranean world, from Greek poetry and the figure modern astronomy calls Orion. But we will carry Australia with us when we do. The cold air, the ceremony, the hidden sister, the feeling that the sky is not empty at all, but full of women still keeping just ahead of those who follow. The old story slows down when it reaches frost. It has to. Some moments cannot be rushed without losing the quiet power that makes them worth remembering. The Seven Sisters rise in the sky, and somewhere below them, the earth answers. That is one of the deepest feelings in the Aboriginal traditions around this star cluster. The heavens are not separate from the body, and the body is not separate from country. Stars appear. Ground changes. Ceremony begins. If you were here in the last dark stretch before dawn, before the first line of sunlight had even thought about lifting itself over the edge of the land, you might notice the cold first in your mouth. The sort of cold that makes the breath feel pale even before you see it. Then you would notice the silence. Not full silence, because country is never truly silent, but a quieter arrangement of sounds. Grass, barely touching grass. A small crack from cooling earth. The faintest movement of someone shifting their weight nearby. Then, as your eyes adjusted, you would see it spread across the ground. Frost. Not thick like a blanket, not theatrical, just enough to silver the skin of the earth so that the land looked as though the stars had descended in the night and rested there. Above, the sisters are still visible. Not high now, not commanding the whole sky, but present, watching over the eastern darkness with their cold clustered light. The old people who preserved these traditions understood something modern life often teaches us to forget. A season is not just weather. It is an instruction, a sign, a change in the relationship between sky and earth. When the seven sisters rise at this time, the land does something in return. Frost appears. Air sharpens. The body is called into ritual attention. The transcript we are drawing from ties this rising of the sisters to coming-of-age rituals in parts of Aboriginal Australia, where older children go to the nearest spring and scrape frost from the ground, then rub it over their bodies. It is a small action when told quickly, but almost nothing in old ceremonial life is truly small. Every movement has weight because it is placed at the right time, in the right sequence, beneath the right sky. So let us slow it down. A group moves toward the spring before sunrise. There is no need for hurried speech. The older ones know the path in the half-dark. The younger ones follow, half solemn, half restless, with that unsettled feeling that comes whenever childhood is about to be asked to loosen its grip. Feet touch ground, made hard by cold. A hand reaches out once to steady another body over stone. Cloth shifts. Skin tightens against the air. The spring itself holds its own little cold world. The water darker than the soil around it. The margins edged with pale frost that clings where shadow has protected it through the night. Someone bends down first. That matters too. In ceremonies, the first movement often belongs to the one who already knows. A finger presses lightly at the crust of white, testing it. Then more frost is gathered, carefully, not in great wasteful sweeps, but in small, deliberate touch. It is passed to the skin, arm, shoulder, chest. Another body does the same. Another. The cold strikes fast. The muscles want to jump away from it. A child might nearly laugh from shock and then swallow the laugh because the moment does not belong to ordinary play. The frost melts slowly against the warmth of the body, and for a few seconds the skin glistens as if coated in a thin layer of dawn itself. The old story says this ritual helps boys grow into strong hunters and girls into beautiful women. Those phrases may sound simple when translated into English, but behind them stands something larger. Ceremony marks transition. The body must be changed by contact with the season, with the ground, with the cold sign sent under the sisters. Adulthood is not only reached by passing time. It is recognized, tested, and shaped. There is also a warning in the ritual. and warnings are where many old stories keep their deepest seriousness. If sunlight touches the body while the frost still clings there, weakness may follow. It is such an elegant image of vulnerability. A child or adolescent covered in the cold gift of the sisters must remain within the right span of darkness and first light. Too early into the sun, and the body does not take the right correctly. Strength drains away instead of gathering. One can hear several layers at once in that warning. Practical caution. Ceremonial timing. The old truth that power often depends not only on what is done, but when it is done. Imagine the tension of those few minutes. The eastern edge of the world beginning to pale. Frost on the skin. Elders watching the horizon as carefully as they watch the children. No one wants the sun to arrive before the ritual is complete. Breath rises. Hands move a little faster now, though still with care. Someone murmurs a final instruction. The sisters above are fading from sight as the sky brightens, but not yet gone. It is as if for one brief passage of time, the people on the ground and the women in the sky share the same fragile cold. I have always found that deeply beautiful. Also, a little haunting. The idea that adulthood might come not through celebration alone, but through measured exposure to something cold, fleeting, and slightly dangerous. It feels true to the way many cultures understand growing up. Strength is given, yes, but never casually. It arrives with discipline, with timing, with a test hidden inside the beauty. In these traditions, the sisters are often associated with water in one form or another. Frost is one form. Ice, in some tellings, is another. Rain in others. This is not a decorative link. Water, especially in Australia, shapes movement, memory, survival, and social order. To connect the seven sisters to frost or cold, shining moisture is to place them inside one of the deepest governing realities of country. They are not only celestial women. They are part of the old cycle by which the land gives signs to those who know how to read them. And reading is really what this is. The frost is red. The stars are red. The season is red. The body is red as it reacts to cold, to fear, to anticipation. Dreaming traditions are not vague dreams floating over the landscape. They are structured ways of understanding what the world is doing. They are observation married to memory, then held in story so that it can live longer than any single generation. The coming-of-age element matters, especially because it binds the seven sisters to community continuity. The stars are not only watched by adults who already know the laws. They are introduced to younger people at the threshold where responsibility begins to gather around them. That makes the sisters part of education, not just cosmology. The sky becomes one of the first teachers, or perhaps one of the oldest. If you think about it long enough, there is something quietly funny in that. Across thousands of years, human beings keep looking up and getting told by old stars that they are not ready yet, that they must wait for the right morning, the right frost, the right body, the right season. The universe has surprisingly little patience for our urge to rush. A useful lesson. Honestly, the story also keeps its darker undertone. The sisters are beautiful, but they are pursued. They shine, but they are vulnerable. They are linked with initiation and fertility, but also with danger and refusal. This tension gives the ritual its edge. The young people entering adulthood under the sign of the sisters are not being welcomed into a simple world. They are being introduced to a world where beauty attracts pursuit, where timing matters, where strength must be gathered before the sun fully rises. Old ceremonial narratives rarely flatter life into sweetness. They give sweetness a shadow and call that honesty. From this frost-lit ritual space, the dreaming reaches outward into wider country. The source transcript reminds us that stories of the seven sisters are said to relate to the time when the first humans came into Australia, naming the land as they spread across the continent. Songs, stories, ritual, and memory carried these ancestral movements forward. That is an enormous claim in emotional terms, even when handled carefully. It means the sisters are not confined to one place or one incident. They move with dispersal. They travel in memory. They become part of the map by which people know where they are and who came before. You can feel that age in the way the story touches other old themes. Floods, fire, strange lights, lost landscapes, dangerous ancestors. These things drift around the edges of many dreaming traditions, not because the people telling them were indulging in fantasy, but because country itself changes, and memory has to store those changes somewhere. A mountain that burned, water that rose, ground that vanished. The seven sisters belong inside that older and wider field of remembrance. They are one thread in a much larger woven sky. Yet even as the story widens, the frost keeps calling us back to the body. Because the body is where sky memory becomes personal. A cluster of stars can be old beyond comprehension, but unless it touches skin, unless it enters ceremony, unless it changes how people move on a particular morning, it remains distant. The Aboriginal traditions close that distance with extraordinary elegance. The sisters rise. Frost forms. Children become older. Country speaks through cold. The sky is no longer merely looked at. It is entered. And that may be why the story has such endurance. It is not only a tale about ancestral women being chased across the heavens. It is a system of relation. The sisters teach through presence. They return at the right time. They make the earth answer in frost. They stand over ritual. They remind the community when change is due. Their beauty is not passive. It orders the season. There is another layer to this that is easy to miss if we only speak in summary. Frost is fragile. It exists for a short time, in a narrow band between dark and sun, and then it is gone. That makes it the perfect ceremonial substance for a story about sisters who are present, beautiful, and still somehow always slipping away. The frost touches the body, then vanishes. The stars hover overhead, then vanish into daylight. One sister is counted, then not seen. The entire emotional logic of the seven sisters gathers around that pattern. Presence, fading, return, presence again. You can feel it if you imagine the children after the ritual is done. They stand a little apart now, rubbing their arms where the cold has melted and left the skin tingling. The elders are calmer. The most delicate moment has passed. Somewhere, a bird has begun to call from a tree, and another answers. And with those sounds, ordinary morning starts to come back into the world. But not fully. Not yet. For a few minutes, the children remain between states. No longer simply what they were in the night. Not yet fully what the day will ask them to become. These in-between moments are where old stories like to work. They reshape people in thresholds. And threshold is really the right word for the sisters themselves. They stand at the edge between girlhood and womanhood, between beauty and danger, between the sky as ornament and the sky as law. They are not passive figures drifting prettily above the land. They are beings whose movement marks a crossing. Once they rise, certain actions are due. Certain rituals belong to that season. Certain children are old enough now to be brought forward. The stars decide nothing by command, and yet they decide much by timing. That makes the story darker, in a quiet way. It is not dark because it revels in pain. It is dark because it understands that growing older means entering a world that has always held pursuit, risk, and the possibility of weakening if one moves carelessly. Even the beauty of the frost carries this lesson. It is lovely, but it must be handled correctly. It cools, bless, and transforms, but it can also vanish too quickly under the wrong light. Life in country often works like that. The same thing that sustains you may also demand precision. Perhaps that is why the Seven Sisters remain so emotionally persuasive. Their story never offers safety as something simple. The women are protected in the sky, yes, but the chase continues. The ritual strengthens the young, yes, but only if timing is respected. The stars return each year, yes, but never in a way that lets anyone forget how much depends on reading the signs properly. It is an old kind of wisdom, not pessimistic, just honest. The world is beautiful and conditional. The sky gives guidance, but not comfort without discipline. And this is where dreaming stories often feel most alive to me. They are full of warmth and tenderness, but they do not flatter human beings into thinking they are above consequence. The cold must be borne. The season must be observed. The right story must be remembered at the right place. The body must learn not just through hearing, but through sensation. Frost on skin, breath in the dark, starlight above. If you forget those textures, you lose more than atmosphere. You lose the mechanism by which memory enters the body and stays there. Soon we will widen further and let the story travel across the continent. Because one of the most striking things about the Seven Sisters traditions in Australia is not that they are identical everywhere, but that they remain recognizably connected while still belonging to many different peoples and many different lands. But before we leave this ceremonial dawn, it is worth lingering one moment more. The first sunlight has almost reached us now. The frost on the bodies has melted away. The spring sits dark and still again. The children who came here before dawn are not quite the same as when they arrived. The sisters above are dissolving into the brightening sky. Their cluster is harder to see now. One by one, the stars retreat into day, though they have not gone anywhere. They are only hidden, which, when you think about it, is a very sisterly thing to do in this story. To remain present, but just out of reach. To let the body remember what the eye can no longer hold. And as the morning opens across country, the old Australian sky keeps its secret for another day. One of the most respectful ways to listen to an Aboriginal sky story is to let it keep its many voices. The Seven Sisters are not held in a single neat version from one end of Australia to the other, and they should not be treated that way. Country changes. Language changes. Ceremony changes. The names of the sisters change. The details of the pursuit shift. Water may appear as frost in one place, as rain or cold brightness in another. Yet across that variation, there remains a recognizable pattern, like the same cluster of stars seen from different ground. This is where the story becomes even more impressive. Not because every community tells it identically, but because so many distinct Aboriginal nations preserve something closely related while rooting it firmly in their own landscapes. Difference and continuity live together here. That is one of the signatures of a very old story. It travels, but it does not remain untouched. It learns the ground it settles in. The source transcript mentions several examples. Among the Adnyamathanha people of South Australia, the sisters are remembered under one name. Among the Bundjalung of northern New South Wales, another form appears. In Western Australia, another again. In Victoria, another. The spellings we see in English vary, and transcription can be a clumsy bridge across languages, but the deeper point remains. The cluster of stars we call the Pleiades is known in many Aboriginal traditions as a group of women, often sisters, and the nearby pattern associated with Orion is often read as pursuing male figures or hunters. If you imagine this continent at night, not as a modern nation bordered on a map, but as a vast spread of countries, languages, pathways, ecologies, and ceremonial worlds, the force of that becomes clearer. The same stars rise over deserts, over grasslands, over forests, over river country, over coast. They rise over different peoples who know their own ground intimately. And still, in place after place, those stars become women under pressure, women in motion, women tied to water and to the dangerous nearness of male pursuit. There is something both delicate and powerful about that continuity. It does not flatten difference into sameness. It allows the story to breathe through local forms. In one country, the sisters may glitter with frost. In another, the emphasis may fall more strongly on rain. In another, on hiding. In another, on being chased across the sky. The old pattern is flexible enough to belong to each place without losing its identity. Honestly, that is how living traditions survive. A story that cannot bend will break. A story that bends too far dissolves. The Seven Sisters seem to have found the perfect middle ground. Stable enough to remain recognizable. Open enough to remain alive. If you were traveling slowly across Australia in the old way, moving by water sources, seasonal paths, and inherited knowledge rather than by roads and engines, the stars would not simply accompany you as scenery. They would become part of orientation, part of timing, part of the layered conversation between sky and ground. A cluster rising at a certain point in the year tells you something. The form it takes in story tells you more. The relation between that story and the place where you stand tells you more again. This is why the sisters can change names without losing power. They are not disconnected symbols floating over the continent. They belong to country by repeated encounter. Let us move. Then, in imagination, South Australia first. The air there can carry a dry stillness at night that makes starlight feel hard and close. Hills hold shadow differently. Stone gives back the day's stored warmth for a while, and then suddenly does not. The cluster rises above a darker horizon, and here the sisters are named in a language shaped by this ground, this weather, this ancestral memory. The story is not generic. It has the grain of the local earth in it. Now northward and eastward, New South Wales. Different vegetation, different water, a different music and speech. The sisters are named again, but not in the same way. The emotional structure remains familiar. Pursuit, women, danger, sky, but the atmosphere has changed. Country always edits a story, not by betraying it, but by teaching it how to fit the wind, the temperature, the ceremonial rhythms of a particular place. Westward, now. Vast country, long distances. The night opening wider, flatter in some regions, the stars perhaps feeling even more exposed because there is so little to interrupt the horizon. Again, the sisters are known. Again, they are not merely pretty lights. Again, the old pattern of women and pursuit returns. In another part of the continent, another people look up and recognize the same cluster, but the names coming out of their mouths are born of their own inheritance. Then Victoria. Another shift. Another country. Another pronunciation of old knowledge. Another version with its own emphases, its own relations between sky and land. The sisters continue to move, or perhaps it is more accurate to say that the people continue to meet them, and each meeting leaves behind its own layer of story. I have always found this one of the most persuasive aspects of ancient oral tradition. Not that it preserves a perfect, fixed script, but that it preserves a durable relationship. The relationship is what survives. The details then bloom around it. Women in the stars. Men behind them. Water. Danger. Ceremony. Memory. These are not random commonplaces. They are the bones of a long-lived sky language. Water deserves another pause here. The transcript points out that many Australian versions involve water in some form. Frost, ice, rain. That repeated association is not minor. In a land where water governs movement, settlement, season, and survival, its appearance in the story reveals how deeply terrestrial the sky narrative remains. The sisters are not simply beautiful because they shine. They are beautiful because they belong to the forms of moisture that touch country at critical moments. Frost over the earth in late winter. Ice in symbolic form. Rain as another sky, gift, or warning. The sisters are not dry stars. They are cold, bright, life-touching presences. This may also be one reason the story carries such ceremonial force. Water transforms. Frost changes the feel of the ground. Rain changes movement. Food, expectation. Initiation itself is often about transformation under the correct conditions. So the sisters, linked to water and season, become natural presences to oversee transitions in human life as well. And always nearby, the men or hunters remain. Orion, or the line of stars Western astronomy calls Orion's belt, becomes in many traditions a group of pursuers. It is a wonderfully clear example of how the sky invites narrative. The sisters cluster together. The belt forms a line. The earth rotates. And to human eyes, it truly can seem as though one follows the other. Across many nights, the motion repeats. There is rhythm in it. Enough rhythm to harden into story, and enough tension to harden into warning. This is where comparison with Greece will eventually become tempting. But I still want to resist it for a little longer, because Aboriginal Australia is full enough on its own. Too often, older colonial habits treated Indigenous stories as interesting because they resembled something European. We should reverse that instinct. The Greek parallel matters later because it sharpens a mystery. But the Australian traditions do not need Greek permission to feel profound. They already hold their own depth, their own age, their own complexity. If you were sitting with me now by the fire, looking up into the black between the trees, or across open desert, I think you would feel that. The sisters above Australia do not feel borrowed. They feel settled, ancient, worn smooth by the mouths that have spoken them for generations. The local names matter because they prove the story has lived not in abstraction, but in community. A story that survives only in books is one kind of old. A story that survives in different languages, across different lands, while still sounding like itself, is another kind entirely. And that brings us to the next layer of the mystery. Because once we accept that Aboriginal Australia holds many forms of this Seven Sisters pattern, the question naturally widens. Why do these forms remain so recognizable? And more unsettlingly, why does a story with such striking overlap also appear on the far side of the world? The overlap, when stripped to its simplest shape, is difficult to ignore. A cluster of stars identified as women, often sisters. A nearby pattern identified as male figures, often hunters. Pursuit between the two. A continuing celestial relationship that repeats night after night. In Australia, this sits inside dreaming, ceremony, country, water, and ancestral law. Elsewhere, as we will soon see, it sits inside another mythic world entirely. And yet the skeletal outline remains. Some people hear that and leap immediately to the grandest conclusion. It must all come from one source, one ancient story, carried intact across the world. It is an enticing thought, perhaps a little too enticing. Stories, like people, can resemble one another without sharing a single recent parent. The sky encourages certain readings simply because of how the stars are arranged and how they appear to move. We need to remember that. We need to let wonder breathe without allowing it to sprint ahead of evidence in expensive shoes. Still, even caution has to admit the resemblance is haunting. Two distant cultural worlds, both seeing women in the Pleiades and male pursuit in Orion. And both, as we will soon explore more directly, carrying the unresolved number problem of 6 visible stars, remembered as 7. That is where the mystery begins to sharpen from interesting to uncanny. There is also a subtle psychological truth in the way the story survives through many local forms. Human beings remember what can be recognized and retold, but they keep returning to it only if it continues to fit their lives. The Seven Sisters do. A cluster of women. A nearby line of pursuit. Water linked to season. A warning folded into beauty. This is strong mythic architecture. It can travel, but it also invites local detail, and that is why it can remain both old and fresh at once. Imagine an elder pointing upward in one region and using a name that would sound unfamiliar only a few hundred kilometers away. To an outsider, this might look like difference, threatening unity. But inside oral culture, it often works the other way. The local name secures the relationship. It says, "These sisters are known here too, in our words, in our country, in the shape that fits our inherited ground." The broader pattern is not weakened by that. It is strengthened. It has found another home. This is one reason broad academic summaries can feel so dry beside lived tradition. A summary says many groups have a Seven Sisters story. True enough. But the lived reality is richer. Many groups have a relationship with these stars. They meet them through song, ceremony, language, practical timing, and local memory. The sky is shared, but the approach is never generic. Each country teaches people how to look up from that exact patch of earth. You know that feeling when you hear a melody played on different instruments, and somehow it remains itself, while also changing character each time. That is what these Aboriginal Seven Sisters traditions feel like. One telling carries more frost, another more rain, another more pursuit, another more ancestral travel, another more ceremonial instruction. The tune remains. The timbre changes. And because the tune remains, we begin to sense just how durable the old pattern must be. The pattern also has a social intelligence to it. It preserves women together rather than alone. That is not a trivial detail. The sisters survive as a cluster, close, mutually defining, difficult to separate, and that clusteredness itself becomes part of their power. In a story of pursuit, proximity is protection. In the sky, too, they remain gathered. The men may follow, but the women are not scattered. They hold formation. Even at the level of pure visual reading, the myth is perceptive. A cluster ahead, a line behind. The old storytellers were not careless observers. They were good at seeing meaning in arrangement. So when we finally do let the Greek comparison enter, it should feel like a distant echo, not the main room. Australia has already given us enough. Enough country. Enough sky. Enough names. Enough evidence that the sisters live here deeply and in many forms. The comparison matters because it adds strangeness. It does not create significance. That significance was already present, rising every year over Aboriginal country, long before anyone drew Mediterranean constellations on paper and called them canonical. For now, though, the Australian night still holds us. The sisters remain what they have been through all these local tellings. Not just stars. Not just a lesson. Not just ceremonial timing. They are also continuity itself. The proof that a story can travel across a continent without becoming empty, can settle into many countries without forgetting its own face. The fire is lower now. Somewhere in the darkness, a little wind has risen and moved through grass with the soft sound of a hand passing over woven fiber. Above us, the cluster still gathers its lights tightly together, as though the sisters know that staying close is part of survival. That image is worth keeping. Women in a cluster. Men behind. Water on the ground. Different people speaking different names under the same night. And just beyond the edge of the Australian story, another version waits, very far away, where the same stars will again become women. The same nearby lights will again become pursuers, and the old question will deepen. Is this kinship, coincidence, or some memory carried farther than we can easily bear to imagine? The Australian night has done its work on us now. That matters, because if we are going to let another version of this old celestial pattern enter the room, it should not enter as the master voice. It should arrive as an echo from very far away, an echo that makes the Australian story feel stranger, not smaller. Too often, modern retellings begin with Greece, as though myth only becomes important once the Mediterranean writes it down. Tonight we reverse that habit. We begin on Aboriginal country, with frost, ritual, water, and women in a clustered light. Only now, after the sisters have already taken their place in the mind, do we turn and notice that on the far side of the world, another people also looked up, also saw women in the same stars, and also felt a pursuing presence behind them. It is one of those moments in comparative mythology that feels almost theatrical the first time you encounter it. You leave one fire, walk for what feels like half the world, sit down beside another, and realize they are both speaking about the same little patch of sky. Not in exactly the same way, not with the same emotional temperature, not with the same ceremonial depth, but with enough overlap to make the heart beat a little faster. The Greek version is the one most modern listeners already know, at least in outline. The Pleiades are the daughters of Atlas and Pleione, beautiful young women moving through the world together. Orion, giant hunter, sees them and gives chase. His pursuit lasts and lasts, until the women, desperate for protection, are transformed and lifted into the sky. In some tellings, they become doves before they become stars. Zeus intervenes. Atlas cannot, because his hands, quite literally, are full with the work of holding up the heavens. The daughters are set among the stars in Taurus. Orion, later, is also placed in the sky. And so the pursuit continues there, not resolved, only immortalized. If you tell that version too quickly, it sounds merely familiar, almost tidy. A standard mythic mechanism. Pursuit, transformation, stars. But if you place it beside the Australian traditions we have already been holding, the resemblance starts to sharpen in a rather unsettling way. Again, a group of women associated with the Pleiades. Again, a male figure or male figures associated with Orion. Again, pursuit. Again, the sky, preserving tension rather than resolving it. Again, female clustering ahead of the pursuer. Again, an old discomfort fixed into the stars. It is difficult not to pause there. You know that feeling when two pieces of music played on different instruments, suddenly reveal the same hidden melody underneath. That is what this comparison does. Australia gives us women in a cluster, pursued, transformed into stars, tied to ritual and water. Greece gives us women in a cluster, pursued by Orion, transformed into stars, tied to divine intervention and celestial placement. The mood differs. The cultural worlds differ enormously. The moral emphases differ. Yet the structure underneath is just close enough to trouble the mind. This is the point where many people become hopeless romantics. I understand why. I really do. There is something intoxicating about the thought that the same old story might have traveled with human beings across immense distances and impossible spans of time, carried not in books, but in mouths, bodies, memory, and the repeating visual logic of the sky. One wants it to be true. That desire itself is part of the story now. Modern people are not immune to myth. We simply move our longing into footnotes and documentaries and then pretend it has become objective. Still, careful listening asks us to hold the comparison in both hands at once. The similarities are real. The temptation to overstate them is real too. Let us look at the overlap slowly, because the source transcript does exactly this. First, both traditions identify the Pleiades as a group of young women, often sisters. Second, both identify the nearby stars of Orion as male figures, often hunters or men in pursuit. Third, both preserve a narrative in which those male figures are behaving in an unwelcome manner toward the women, and the pattern of the sky itself is read through that movement. Cluster ahead, pursuers behind. A celestial chase. That is enough to raise a serious question. It may not be enough to settle one. The geographic distance between Greece and Aboriginal Australia is part of what gives the comparison its force. These are not neighboring peoples casually swapping stories over a convenient hill. They belong to very different language families, very different ceremonial and literary worlds, very different recorded histories, and very different relationships to land and sky. If the overlap comes from a common source, then the source must be very old indeed. Older than European arrival in Australia, obviously. Older than classical Greece, certainly. Older, perhaps, than the great separations that carried human populations out of Africa and across Eurasia. And there the mind begins to enter deep time. Imagine early human groups moving under a sky not yet crowded by cities, not yet dimmed by smoke and electric glare, carrying children, tools, fire, food, grief, and the half-formed beginnings of countless stories. Above them, Orion and the Pleiades. The same relation in the sky then as now, though perhaps not exactly the same in every detail. A group of stars clustered together. Another line of stars seeming to follow. One can see how narrative would gather there naturally. One can also see why a story built on such an arrangement might survive separation better than many other stories. The sky travels with everyone. It does not stay behind when you leave one country for another. That is one of the strongest reasons this comparison keeps returning in scholarship and popular imagination alike. A star story is portable. It needs no carved temple, no fixed monument, no written archive in order to move with a people. It needs only eyes, memory, and a reason to keep telling it. But the very portability of sky stories creates a problem too. Because if the same stars are visible to many peoples, then similar stories may arise independently. Orion is one of the most noticeable patterns in the night sky. The Pleiades are one of the most noticeable clusters. The apparent movement of the sky makes Orion seem to follow. The visual invitation to tell a pursuit story is very strong. So strong, perhaps, that one must not mistake inevitability for evidence. The source transcript is careful here, and we should be too. It asks whether the similarity between Australia and Greece reflects the same original story, or whether the overlap is coincidence produced by the prominence of the stars and the universality of certain motifs. Hunters chasing prey or women are not rare motifs in human storytelling, nor is the tendency to imagine groups of clustered stars as groups of people. Pattern recognition is one of our oldest habits, perhaps our oldest. Human beings do it to survive, and then they do it again in story, because survival and imagination are old companions. Even so, the overlap keeps its eerie quality. Part of that eeriness lies in emotional tone. In both worlds, the women are not merely decorative. They are under pressure. Desire becomes threat. Distance becomes protection. Transformation into stars does not fully end danger. The chase continues in the sky. That emotional shape is not guaranteed by the stars alone. It is one thing to see pursuit in Orion and the Pleiades. It is another to tell it as a story of women needing protection from male pursuit. That is where the comparison begins to feel more pointed. And yet, when we listen closely, the differences are just as revealing. In Greece, the story sits inside a larger mythological family of gods, titans, divine seductions, and cosmic placements. Zeus intervenes. Atlas is trapped in his burden. Orion has his own mythic life beyond the chase. The whole tale belongs to a literary and theological world that delights in genealogy and divine entanglement. In Aboriginal Australia, by contrast, the sisters are rooted in dreaming, in country, in ceremony, in the relation between sky and seasonal practice. Water matters more. Frost matters. Ritual timing matters. Song matters. The story remains local and bodily in a way that the Greek version does not. It belongs to the ground as much as to the stars. That difference is so important that it may itself argue against a fully shared, preserved narrative. If the stories came from one source, they have changed so much in function that we must be cautious about how much sameness we claim. Still, even caution cannot fully dissolve the wonder of the comparison. Two very distant human worlds looked up and told of women in the cluster, of men in Orion, of pursuit inscribed into the turning of the sky. Perhaps this is coincidence. Perhaps not. Either way, it tells us something profound about how human beings meet the stars. We read movement as intention. We read closeness as relationship. We read recurrence as fate. The sky becomes drama because drama is one of the oldest tools by which memory survives. There is another subtle point here. In both traditions, the women remain together. They are not isolated as single stars with separate destinies. They form a cluster, close and mutually defined. Orion, by contrast, is stretched out, larger, looser in form, more linear. The sky itself almost composes the emotional contrast. The women hold together. The pursuer extends toward them. That shape may explain why these particular stories attach so persistently to these stars and not to countless others. The visual grammar is simply too strong to ignore. If you were standing here with me now and we shifted our gaze from the clustered sisters to Orion rising behind, you would feel it for yourself. No need for specialized vocabulary. No need for scholarly apparatus at first. Just the eye-reading relation. There they are. There he is. Or there they are as men, depending on the tradition. There is the distance. There is the following. The story is already half told before language arrives. That may be why the oldest and most durable myths often feel inevitable once you hear them. They fit the world so snugly that you wonder how anyone ever saw anything else. Before we move on, it is worth noticing one more thing about the Greek echo. In that version too, rescue is incomplete. The women are lifted away, but the nearness of Orion in the sky means the pressure never fully ends. That detail brings it unexpectedly close to the Australian emotional world, where transformation protects the sisters, yet does not erase the old pattern of being followed. Safety in both stories is real, but never simple. The stars preserve distance, not forgetfulness. And perhaps that is another reason the comparison lingers so stubbornly in the mind. Both traditions understand that some dangers are not solved by a single act. They are only held at a distance, repeated in form, carried into memory, where they can be watched night after night without ever being fully dismissed. And now, after bringing Greece into view, the old Australian mystery begins to sharpen rather than blur. Because the comparison does not merely tell us that pursuit stories can arise around these stars, it leads us toward the stranger and perhaps stronger clue, the one that has less to do with human motive and more to do with the stubborn memory of the eye itself. Why, in both Australia and in many other places, do people continue to call these stars seven when, for most observers, they appear to be six? That question sits underneath the Greek comparison like a hidden ember. It is not only the chase that links traditions. It is the count, the unresolved number, the insistence that one more star ought to be there than most people can now plainly see. This is where the story becomes less like pure literary comparison and more like a piece of memory trying to survive a change in the sky. The women are seven, people say, even while the eye protests. 7 sisters, not 6, never 6. And when the eye says otherwise, story enters to explain the loss. So we have done what we needed to do. We let Greece enter, not as ruler, but as witness. It confirms that the pattern is not only Australian. It confirms that the comparison is real enough to matter. It also warns us that resemblance is not the same thing as proof. The old romance remains possible, but not yet secure. For that, we need another clue. Not another hunter. Not another divine rescue. Another number. And in the cold black between those clustered stars, someone is still missing. The number is where the story grows most haunting. A pursuit tale, however old, can still be explained away as one more example of human beings seeing drama in the sky. But a number that refuses to match the eye is harder to dismiss so easily. The cluster is called the Seven Sisters in Aboriginal traditions, in Greek traditions, and in many others around the world. Yet most people, under ordinary conditions, see 6 stars clearly, sometimes 5, sometimes a doubtful 7th, if the sky is unusually dark and the eye unusually kind. But the old naming remains stubborn. 7. As if memory and vision had fallen slightly out of step. This is not a modern puzzle invented by people with telescopes and too much leisure. Ancient observers noticed it too. Greek poets could list the sisters by name and still remark that only 6 were visible to the eye. The same discomfort appears again and again across many parts of the world. One culture says a sister hid herself. Another says she died. Another says she was taken. Another says she dimmed in shame. Another says she fell. Another says she is simply there, but cannot now be seen properly. Different explanations. Same underlying pressure. There ought to be 7. I have always found that almost unbearably eerie. Not because it proves anything by itself, but because it feels exactly like the sort of thing story does when it is trying to preserve a fact that the senses no longer comfortably support. A mismatch appears. The eye says one thing, tradition says another. So the imagination builds a bridge. Not randomly, but with remarkable persistence. Missing sister stories appear in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, in North America, and in Australia. That does not happen by accident very often. Let us sit with the Aboriginal side first, because that remains the center of the night for us. In some traditions, one sister is hidden or gone. In some versions, 1 or 2 of the girls are taken or dimmed. The exact explanation differs, but the emotional effect remains the same. The cluster is incomplete in some quiet way. The women are together, but not entirely. Their number has been wounded. There is beauty there, but also absence. A story of pursuit becomes, almost without warning, a story of loss. Loss in the sky is a very particular kind of sadness. It is not like losing a path on Earth, or a house, or a person whose face one knew at close range. A missing star remains visible as a shape in the mind long after it stops standing apart to the eye. You look at the cluster and feel the lack of something your own sight cannot quite justify. It is the perfect material for myth. Small enough to repeat, subtle enough to survive, painful enough to be remembered. Across cultures, the explanations for the lost sister are sometimes surprisingly intimate. In Greek tradition, one of the sisters may dim because she loved a mortal man and felt shame. In some Aboriginal forms, one is dead, hidden, or taken away. In parts of North America, stories speak of fading. In other traditions, the star falls to earth or withdraws from sight. The motifs vary, but they all reveal the same human instinct. If the count says 7 and the eye gives 6, the absent one must have a story. The source transcript leans into this strongly, and rightly so. If people in many parts of the world preserve the idea that there were once 7 visible stars, then perhaps the origin of the motif lies not only in symbolism, but in observation. We should not overstate this too quickly. Stories are not instruments. Yet stories can preserve observational memory with surprising tenacity, especially when the thing observed is simple, repeated, and striking. A seventh star fading from easy view over immense spans of time would be exactly the kind of subtle change no single generation could document scientifically, but many generations might preserve emotionally. The astronomy enters carefully here, like someone pushing open a heavy door without wanting it to creak. The Pleiades are a young star cluster by cosmic standards. Several of the brighter stars are what astronomers call B-type stars, and some show variable brightness. They also lie within surrounding nebulous dust, which changes the way we perceive the cluster's glow. None of that by itself is enough to prove that one star was plainly visible and then vanished from common human sight. But it begins to create a setting in which slight changes in appearance are not absurd to imagine. More significant is motion. Stars are not fixed in any absolute sense. They move, only so slowly that human life rarely feels the movement directly, over tens of thousands of years. Though, the relations between stars can alter enough to change what the naked eye can distinguish. This is where the star Pleione becomes so important in the modern discussion. Pleione sits very close to Atlas in the cluster today, close enough that for many observers, the two are difficult to separate cleanly without excellent conditions. But if, in the distant past, Pleione stood a little farther from Atlas in apparent position, then the cluster might have looked more obviously like 7 distinct stars to ordinary human beings. The transcript describes scholarly work that simulated the Pleiades further back in time and argued that around 70,000 to 100,000 years ago, Pleione would have appeared more clearly separated from Atlas. If so, a person with good eyesight under a truly dark sky might naturally have counted 7 bright stars rather than 6. That would not only explain the old naming, it would explain the emotional force with which cultures later insisted that one star had been lost. Now, we should breathe here and remain careful. Some of the data used in earlier versions of this argument has been challenged. Measurements have improved. Error margins matter. Astronomical reconstructions, like all reconstructions, are only as good as their assumptions. Some scholars think the older simulations overstated the separation. Others point out that even with corrected values, conditions may still have allowed a 7th star to stand out more clearly than it does now, especially to observers trained by dark skies and a lifetime of looking. We cannot be sure. The point is possibility, not certainty. Still, possibility can be powerful when it fits the cultural pattern so well. Imagine a night sky tens of thousands of years ago, long before writing, long before cities, before the first walls rose in Mesopotamia, before classical Greece, before almost everything people casually call history. Human beings sit beside fire on ground that has not yet been divided into modern nations. Above them, the Pleiades gleam as 7 clear points. 7 sisters. A neat small cluster, complete. Over long ages, the stars drift in relation, almost imperceptibly. The 7th becomes harder to distinguish. The eye begins to lose what the tradition remembers. But the name remains, because names are often more loyal than vision. That possibility is what makes the missing sister motif feel so much older than the pursuit story itself. A chase between men and women can arise in many cultural settings. but a widespread insistence on 7 where 6 are now seen suggests something more specific. It suggests a memory attached not only to symbolic interpretation, but to an actual visual condition of the sky that changed. And if that is right, then the implications become astonishing. The ancestors of Aboriginal Australians separated from other human populations during the dispersals out of Africa in deep prehistory. The precise pathways and timings are complex, and archaeology keeps refining them. But the broad outline is enough for tonight. Human groups moved outward. Some eventually became the ancestors of those who populated Eurasia. Others continued toward Sahu, the ancient landmass connecting Australia and New Guinea when sea levels were lower. Aboriginal Australians, once established, preserved an unbroken line of cultural continuity on the continent over immense spans of time. If the Pleiades really did look more obviously like 7 bright stars before or during those deep dispersal windows, then a motif about 7 stars becoming 6 could theoretically have traveled with some of the earliest human communities and survived in transformed but recognizable form. That is the thrilling possibility. Also the dangerous one, because thrilling possibilities make people sloppy if they fall in love too quickly. The source transcript handles this with more care than many popular treatments do. It distinguishes between the missing star motif, which may indeed be extraordinarily old, and the full hunter-chasing women narrative, which is much harder to prove as a single preserved story from such depth. That distinction matters. We should linger in it. The sky memory of 7 becoming 6 may be one thing. The dramatic structure built around Orion pursuing the sisters may be another, added, reshaped, or reinvented in multiple places because the stars invite that reading. One is a numeric memory. The other is a mythic narrative. They do not necessarily share the same age. Even so, the missing sister remains the stronger clue, and tonight she deserves our full attention. If you were lying under a perfect dark Australian sky with someone beside you who knew the old stories, they might ask you to count. You would do it once and hesitate. Then again, the cluster would shimmer slightly in the cold, never quite still, as if the stars themselves were breathing. 6, you would say. Maybe 6. And the old person beside you might answer softly, no, there are 7. There were 7. One is hidden now. In that moment, you would feel something rare in human life, the meeting point between myth and observation. Not certainty, but a pressure of meaning. The sense that story might be remembering what the eye has nearly forgotten. And that is why the lost sister stories are so moving. They are not merely decorative excuses for an inconvenient count. They are acts of preservation. They keep open the place where the missing light used to stand. They refuse to let the cluster settle fully into 6. They maintain an emotional vacancy in the sky so that memory has somewhere to live. Aboriginal traditions are especially powerful here because they do not isolate the lost sister as a trivial detail. Her absence belongs to a wider world of pursuit, protection, ritual timing, and women's clustered presence. She is not a footnote. She is the ache inside the whole naming. 7 sisters. The phrase itself insists that absence is not enough to erase kinship. Even if only 6 are seen, the 7th still belongs to the group. She remains counted. That is a deeply human kind of loyalty. It is also, perhaps, why the motif spread so well. Numbers are memorable. Missing persons are memorable. The combination of the two is nearly indestructible. Tell a child there are 6 stars, and the child may shrug. Tell a child there are 7 sisters, but one is missing, and the child will never forget. Oral cultures understand this instinctively. They embed memory in small wounds. A missing sister is exactly such a wound. The transcript cites scholars who regard this global testimony as meaningful evidence that the 7th star was once more easily visible. Others remain skeptical, and some of that skepticism is healthy. Astronomical variability is subtle. Human eyesight varies. Atmospheric conditions vary. Simulations can mislead if read too confidently. All true, yet the existence of so many independent lost star stories should keep us from dismissing the whole matter too lightly. Human beings do not usually invent the same inconvenience for themselves without some underlying pressure. So where does this leave us by the end of this part of the journey? It leaves us with a mystery that is older and colder than the pursuit stories alone. A cluster of stars remembered as 7 across continents and millennia. A visible count that no longer fits the inherited number. Aboriginal traditions that preserve not only the sisters themselves, but their danger, their seasonal significance, and in some cases, the loss or hiding of one among them. Astronomy that offers, if not final proof, then at least a plausible pathway by which a 7th star might once have stood more clearly apart. Human dispersal into deep prehistory, opening the breathtaking possibility that the count itself may be a relic of an ancient sky shared by early peoples before their long separation. That is enough wonder for one night already. More than enough, really. And yet one more question waits just beyond it, quiet and stubborn. If the motif of 7 becoming 6 may truly be that old, what are we to do with the Fuller Chase story? Is that ancient too? Or did different peoples, under different skies and with different needs, attach their own local dramas to a much older remembered number? The missing sister does not answer that. She only points toward it, dimly, like a light just beyond the edge of sight. The story becomes most delicate when it enters deep time. Up to this point, we have been able to move with reasonable confidence through things human beings do very well. We compare patterns. We listen to traditions. We notice that Aboriginal Australia preserves the 7 sisters with remarkable continuity and local richness. We notice that Greece, very far away, tells a strangely similar pursuit story. We notice that many cultures insist on 7 stars, where most eyes now see 6. All of that is substantial. But once we begin asking whether this might reach back 70,000 years or more, the ground under our feet changes. We are no longer only listening to story. We are trying to listen to time itself. The source transcript handles that threshold with a mixture of excitement and caution, which is exactly right. Because it is one thing to say a tradition feels very old. It is another to ask whether part of it might preserve a memory from before the dispersal of human populations across much of the world. That kind of claim needs to be carried carefully, like a bowl filled too close to the edge. Let us begin where the stronger clue lies. Not with Orion, not with hunters, not even with pursuit, with the count. 7 stars becoming 6. If that motif really does preserve a memory of how the Pleiades once appeared to the naked eye, then the crucial period is not classical antiquity, not even early farming, but the far older horizon, when human groups still shared portions of a common ancestral sky memory before splitting and traveling into different regions of the world. Imagine that for a moment, not as an abstract diagram in a textbook, but as a lived scene. The world is colder in some places, wider in others. Coastlines, not yet what we know now. Human groups move in stages, not in one heroic march, but in generations of departure. Fire carried, children carried, tools shaped and reshaped, hunger endured, water found and lost. And above them, always above them, the same cluster of small lights rising in the dark. 7 clear stars, perhaps, or clear enough to be counted as 7 by eyes trained from birth under perfect black skies. People name them, or perhaps naming comes later and memory comes first. Either way, the cluster enters human thought long before anyone can record a word. This is why the Aboriginal Australian traditions matter so much in this discussion. Once the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians reached Sahul and, over long stretches of time, spread through the continent, they continued one of the deepest unbroken cultural continuities on Earth. That continuity is not simplistic. It contains change, local variation, adaptation, and immense complexity. But it is continuous, which means that when a star tradition in Aboriginal Australia seems old, we are not speaking casually. We are speaking within one of the rare human cultural contexts where very great antiquity is not a theatrical exaggeration, but a serious possibility. The source transcript points out that the ancestors of First Nations Australians separated from the populations that would later spread through Eurasia at least 70,000 years ago, perhaps a little earlier, depending on how one models the dispersals. The exact dates are debated, as such dates often are, and should never be handled with smug certainty. Still, the broad frame remains. There was a deep separation. If a motif appears in both Aboriginal Australia and far western Eurasia, and if that motif is not easily explained by recent contact, then one possible explanation is that some part of it descends from an extremely ancient common inheritance. This is where the astronomical argument about Pleione and Atlas becomes so tantalizing. If the stars were more distinctly separated 70,000 or 100,000 years ago, then the memory of 7 visible stars could indeed predate those dispersals. It could have traveled with people as they spread. It could have survived in different cultural worlds because the number itself was already attached to the cluster before the populations diverged too far to share stories directly. That would make the missing sister motif one of the oldest narrative elements known in human culture. Not the oldest fully formed story, perhaps, but one of the oldest durable mythic fragments. There is something almost frightening in that thought. A tiny numerical memory lasting longer than agriculture, longer than cities, longer than metallurgy, longer than writing, longer than every empire we casually call ancient. A small disagreement between I and inheritance, surviving through tens of thousands of years because people kept refusing to let the seventh sister disappear. And yet, even here, honesty asks us not to let excitement turn careless. The source transcript is very clear that the evidence for the full chase story being that old is weaker. And that is where the distinction between motif and myth becomes essential. A motif is a durable element, a remembered piece, a pattern that can survive immense change. A full myth is a more complete narrative, with characters, relationships, actions, and emotional shape. Motifs often travel farther and survive longer than complete stories. This is one of the quiet rules of comparative mythology, and it matters greatly tonight. 7 becoming 6 may be a motif of astonishing age. The women being chased by hunters may be much younger in its fully developed local forms, even if its ingredients are old. Aboriginal Australia may have woven that pursuit into dreaming, ceremony, country, and law in ways that are profoundly ancient there. Greece may have woven it into a very different literary and divine framework later. The overlap may therefore be real without requiring that every detail of one descends intact from a single primordial script. You know that feeling when you want the grand answer so badly that the careful answer begins to feel almost rude? That is where many people sit with this material. They want the full story to be the oldest story in the world. They want the sisters, the hunters, the pursuit, the missing star, all of it to go back together into the first great migrations of our species. It would be a marvelous thing to say. It may even be partly true, but the evidence, at least for now, seems stronger for the number than for the whole plot. And honestly, I think that makes the material more beautiful, not less. Because what survives across deep time may not be a perfect script. It may be a wound in memory, a pressure point, a stubborn number. 7. Those 6 are seen. That is enough to generate stories again and again wherever human beings still care to look up. The old motif acts almost like a seed. In one culture, it grows into dreaming women tied to ceremony, frost, water, and ancestral movement across Australia. In another, it grows into Atlas's daughters fleeing Orion beneath the Greek sky. In another, it becomes a tale of hiding, shame, falling, dimming, or loss. The same old seed, different flowers. The source transcript also notes an important challenge to the stronger claim. Orion and the Pleiades are simply too obvious, too visible, too inviting. Nearly every culture that pays attention to the sky is likely to say something about them. Orion appears dynamic. The Pleiades appear clustered and intimate. The Earth's rotation makes Orion seem to follow. Hunters and pursued figures are common human motifs, especially in societies where hunting shaped life deeply. So we must allow the possibility that similar pursuit stories arose independently because the stars almost ask for it. This point can feel disappointing if one is in a romantic mood, yet it is also deeply humanizing. It tells us that people in very different places may have met the same sky and made similar emotional sense of it because human perception itself has certain recurring instincts. We are not infinitely inventive. We are beautifully repetitive. We notice the same tensions. We tell the same broad dramas. We turn moving lights into relation because relation is how we understand the world. Still, even if the chase motif arose more than once, the number may not have. That is the strange hinge. Independent storymaking may explain the hunters, It is less comfortable as an explanation for the remarkably widespread insistence that there were 7 visible stars, and that one was later lost. There, the eye and the inherited count feel too oddly aligned for coincidence alone to satisfy completely. And so the Australian sky returns once more as the most important witness, because in Aboriginal traditions, the sisters are not isolated in a dry academic puzzle. They remain embedded in ritual and country. They are still connected to frost, to ceremony, to coming of age, to local names, to ancestral movement across land. This means that if an ancient motif truly has survived here, it has not survived as a fossil. It has survived as a living relation. That may be the most extraordinary part of all. Deep time, not in a museum drawer, but still breathing in story. Imagine a line of continuity that long. Elders naming the sisters, children learning when they rise, ritual bodies waiting for frost. The absent stars still counted. Generations passing under the same small cluster, while empires elsewhere rise and fall without their names ever mattering here. It gives the whole question an almost unbearable calm. The sky changes slowly. Humans remember in layers. Country holds both. There is another reason the motif may outlast the full narrative, and it has to do with how memory chooses its anchors. A whole story asks a lot of a community. It asks for sequence, names, motives, explanations, and emotional emphasis. A motif asks less. It asks only to be recognized when the right sign appears. 7, not 6. A missing sister. A count that does not settle. That sort of thing can travel astonishing distances because it is light enough to carry and strong enough to matter. Then, once settled in a local world, it gathers fresh meaning around itself. In Aboriginal Australia, that gathered meaning is profound. The sisters become part of local law, part of women's story in some traditions, part of warning, part of ceremony, part of the relation between season and body. The old count lives not as a dead numeral, but as a social fact embedded in ritual. A child learns there are 7 sisters long before any academic debate about proper motion or stellar separation could possibly matter. By the time the child is older, the number is no longer merely counted. It is inhabited. That is how old sky memory survives. It is folded into life before it is ever folded into argument. The migration question also has a strangely moving emotional side. We often speak of human dispersal as though it were a map animation, arrows spreading neatly across continents. But in lived time, it would have felt nothing like that. It would have felt like families leaving what they knew, finding new coastlines, new rivers, new dangers, new absences. Under those circumstances, a repeating sky pattern would not be trivial. It might be one of the few stable companions available. The same small cluster rising after another harsh journey, after another season of uncertainty, after another death, after another birth. If a count was attached to that cluster, and if that count mattered, then the count may have become a comfort as much as a fact. There is a quiet irony in all this. Modern people often assume that the oldest parts of culture must be the loudest, the most dramatic, the most obvious. Yet what may survive longest is a tiny discrepancy, a little refusal to agree with the eye, a phrase repeated so often that it outlives the conditions that first made it sensible. 7 sisters. It sounds poetic now. It may once have been observational before it became poetic. Or both at once, which is how the best old stories usually work. Some scholars also point out that people living under consistently dark skies can distinguish subtleties that many modern observers simply cannot. That should make us humble. We speak so easily about what a human eye can or cannot see, forgetting that most of our own eyes have been trained by softened darkness, urban light, indoor life, and glancing attention. Ancient and indigenous sky watchers were not casual consumers of the heavens. They were practitioners of attention. Even if Pleione and Atlas were only slightly more separated in the remote past than now, such eyes may have made more of that distinction than ours can comfortably imagine. The sky gives more to those who stay with it. And perhaps staying with it is the real theme here. The stars do not reveal themselves all at once. Deep time does not reveal itself all at once either. One must sit, look again, count again, doubt, remember, compare, and then count once more. The 7 sisters almost seem designed to train that patience. If you were standing here with me now, the fire would be low enough that the stars had begun to feel stronger than the flames. The sisters would be very clear. 6 to the eye, perhaps. 7 to the story. Orion or his Australian equivalents not far off behind. And all at once you might feel the true scale of the thing, not because we have solved it, but because we have not. The unresolved quality is what makes it ancient. The old memory is still incomplete, still partly hidden, still asking to be held rather than conquered. That is perhaps the right emotional posture for deep time. Not triumph, not certainty. Attention. Because what seems strongest by the end of this long trail is this: the motif of 7 stars, remembered where 6 are mostly seen, may indeed reach back to a very early human sky. Perhaps 70,000 years. Perhaps more. Perhaps less. But certainly into astonishing depth. The Aboriginal 7 Sisters traditions may therefore preserve one of the oldest living sky memories known to us, even if the full pursuit narrative cannot yet be dated with the same confidence. That is already enough to make the night feel larger than usual, and it prepares us for the final movement. Not a grand revelation, but a quieter ending. One in which we separate what we can say from what we only want to say, and in doing so perhaps become more worthy of the old stories themselves. By the time a story reaches this kind of age, certainty is no longer the right candle to hold beside it. The flame is too sharp. It throws hard edges where the old material asks for softer attention. What we need here at the end is not a final verdict, spoken too loudly, but a more patient kind of honesty. The sort that can sit beside wonder without trying to own it. So let us gather what has remained with us through the night. Aboriginal Australia remembers the Pleiades as the 7 Sisters, not as a decorative label borrowed from elsewhere, but as part of dreaming, country, ceremony, seasonal return, and ancestral memory. The sisters are women. They are radiant, vulnerable, pursued, and enduring. They are linked with water, with frost, with ritual transition, with the body standing under the sky at the correct moment. Across the continent, their names differ. Their local details differ. Their ceremonial settings differ. Yet the broad pattern remains recognizably itself. That alone would make them one of the most compelling sky traditions on Earth. Then we looked outward and found that very far away another culture, Greece, also saw women in the Pleiades and pursuit in Orion. The comparison is real. It is too striking to dismiss with a shrug. Yet it is not enough, by itself, to prove that the full story traveled intact from a single prehistoric source. The sky is too visible, human pattern making too active, pursuit too common a motif. Similarity is meaningful. It is not automatically inheritance. And then the older mystery opened beneath both stories. Why do so many cultures remember 7 stars, where most observers now see 6? That question, more than the chase itself, seems to reach toward the deepest layer. The widespread lost sister motifs, the persistence of the number, the astronomical possibility that one star once stood more clearly apart. All of this together creates a case that is not final, but very hard to ignore. Some scholars argue that this preserves a real memory of the sky from 70,000 to 100,000 years ago. Others remain more cautious. We cannot be sure, but the possibility is serious enough to deserve respect. There is something almost tender in that phrase. We cannot be sure. People often hear caution as disappointment. I hear it differently. Caution is a way of keeping wonder clean. It stops us from making the old stories serve our hunger for headlines. It lets them remain larger than our conclusions. And honestly, when the material is this old, it feels like the only decent way to proceed. The source transcript itself arrives at a conclusion much like this. The full hunter chasing women story may be ancient, perhaps even very ancient, but the evidence is not yet strong enough to declare it confidently as the oldest complete story in the world. The motif of 7 stars, remembered where 6 are now visible, though, may indeed be one of the oldest narrative fragments human beings still carry. That distinction matters. It keeps us from claiming too much while still allowing the night to remain extraordinary. If anything, the modesty of that conclusion makes the Aboriginal traditions more powerful, because they do not need a sensational label to matter. They matter already. They matter because they are living, because they bind stars to country, because they bind ritual to season, because they let children grow into adulthood under the sign of ancestral women in the sky, because they preserve memory not as text alone, but as voice, movement, touch, and timing. The sisters are not old only because someone can theorize a date for them. They are old because generation after generation refused to stop meeting them. I think that is one of the loveliest truths in all of this. The stars may change slowly. Human cultures change too. Languages shift. Ceremonies adapt. People move, suffer, survive, are interrupted, recover. And still, somewhere on country, someone looks up when the season turns and says, there they are. The sisters have returned. In that moment, the age of the story is not abstract. It is present. It breathes. The modern world, with all its instruments and simulations and scholarly disputes, can sometimes make old sky stories feel smaller, as if measurement drains them of meaning. Yet tonight, the opposite seems true. The more we learn, the stranger the sisters become. Stellar motion does not diminish them. It deepens them. Migration history does not reduce them. It enlarges the scale on which their memory might matter. Scholarly caution does not flatten them. It protects them from being used too crudely. The old story survives every lens we place near it, and in some ways grows more haunting with each one. There is also a quiet lesson here about what endures. Great monuments fall. Kingdoms crack and are forgotten. Libraries burn. Coastlines shift. Yet a small pattern in the sky, carried in story, can remain alive longer than almost anything else human beings make. Not because it is written in stone, but because it is written into habit, into the timing of ritual, into the naming of a cluster, into the ache of a missing sister, into the body remembering frost before dawn. That may be why the ending of this story does not feel like an ending at all. The sisters do not conclude. They recur. Every year they return to the sky. Every generation they can be counted again. 6 for the eye, perhaps. 7 for the memory. The question renews itself as easily as breathing. Where is the missing one? How old is this count? Why does the story follow the stars so faithfully? Those questions are not failures of conclusion. They are the reason the tradition remains alive. If you were still sitting here beside me now, the fire nearly spent, you might feel a certain softness entering the room. The kind that comes when the mind has traveled very far and is finally ready to rest. The Australian sky above us would be as clear as before, but gentler now. Less like a puzzle, more like company. The sisters would remain clustered together, close enough to be felt as one presence even when the eye cannot fully separate them all. Orion, or the pursuing forms, read in nearby stars, would still linger in relation. The old tension would remain, but softened by distance, by repetition, by the simple fact that what endures in the sky also teaches patience. That may be the final gift of the 7 sisters. Not certainty, not proof, not the neat vanity of saying we have solved the oldest story in the world. Something quieter. They teach us how memory can survive by adapting without surrendering itself. They teach us that absence can be counted, that a missing light may remain part of the family. That story can hold a place open for what the eye has nearly lost. They teach us that country and sky are never fully separate, and that old knowledge often arrives not as proclamation, but as recurrence. The stars return. The frost forms. The story is told again. The child becomes older. The sister remains missing, and yet still present. And perhaps that is enough. More than enough. So let the numbers soften now. Let the theories loosen their grip. Let the scholars, the poets, the elders, the children, the astronomers, the storytellers, all sit together for a moment beneath the same clustered lights. Let the Australian night keep its dignity. Let the missing sister remain just beyond clear sight. Let the old memory continue doing what it has always done, refusing to vanish simply because we can no longer see all of it at once. And there is one more reason the ending belongs under the Australian sky rather than in a purely comparative chart. Aboriginal traditions do not preserve the sisters as a curiosity. They preserve them as relation. That difference is easy to say and hard to fully appreciate. A curiosity can be admired and put away. A relation must be renewed. It has duties attached to it. It has timing attached to it. It may shape who speaks, who listens, who acts, and when. The stars do not simply mean something. They ask something. That is why they stay alive. Modern viewers often want a ranking. The oldest story, the oldest myth, the oldest proof. But old traditions are not foot race. They are webs. Some parts of them are older than others. Some motifs endure where whole plots shift. Some names are local and recent, beside structures that may be very ancient. Some ceremonial uses may be newer than the sky pattern itself and still be profoundly old by any ordinary human measure. Trying to force all of that into a single headline does violence to the material. The Seven Sisters deserve better than that. And there is a kind of relief in allowing the answer to remain layered. It means we can say yes. Aboriginal Australia may hold one of the deepest living sky memories on Earth. Yes, the motif of seven remembered, where six are seen, may be extraordinarily ancient. Yes, the wider pursuit story may also contain ancient ingredients. And yes, the full evidential chain is still incomplete. Those statements do not cancel one another. They make one another more truthful. I think of the missing sister here again. She is the perfect emblem for the whole investigation. Present in the tradition, absent from easy sight, real enough to shape the count, elusive enough to resist simple demonstration. The scholarship circles her. The old stories hold a place for her. The eye strains and almost catches her. That is what working with deep human memory often feels like. Not grasping the lost thing fully, but keeping faith with the place where it belongs. Perhaps that is why these stories have such a calming effect when they are told softly. They remind us that not everything valuable can be pinned down without remainder. Some truths arrive through recurrence and relation, rather than proof in the narrow sense. The sisters rise. The season turns. Children learn the count. Elders remember the names. The cluster keeps drawing human attention back toward what was once brighter, or at least once counted differently. That is not ignorance. It is fidelity. If we let the final mood settle properly, then the night becomes less about solving a riddle and more about sharing company with a very old uncertainty. The sort of uncertainty that does not agitate, but steadies. Human beings have lived with the same small puzzle in the sky for longer than we can comfortably imagine. They have turned it into story, ceremony, longing, instruction, and care. In a world that often forgets how to stay with anything, that may be the most ancient wisdom of all. So the sisters remain where they have always been. Above country, above argument, above the shifting fashions of scholarship and speculation. Sometimes six to the eye, always seven to the story. Still close together, still just ahead of pursuit. Still teaching patience to anyone willing to look long enough. And maybe, in the end, that is why this story fits the sleep hour so well. Night does not demand that every old question be solved before rest is allowed. Night only asks that we sit with what remains luminous. A small cluster. A remembered number. Women in the sky. Frost on the ground. The body growing older beneath returning stars. The absent one still counted. The mind can loosen around those things without losing them. If you were to step outside now, in the right season, away from the nearest hard white lights, and let your eyes settle into darkness, you would see the same little gathering that people have watched for uncounted generations. You might count 6 and then feel the old discomfort. Good. That discomfort is part of the inheritance. It means the story is already working on you. It means memory has reached across time once more and touched the present through a tiny flaw in certainty. And somewhere, in communities that have kept these relations alive with care and persistence, the sisters are not simply an interesting question. They are still part of a world of obligations, stories, timings, and inherited attention that is worth ending with. Not the thrill of claiming ownership over the oldest thing, but the quieter gratitude that some old things have survived at all, and survived in living hands. The Australian sky does not need us to finish it. It was complete before we began listening, and it will remain there after we fall asleep. The sisters will rise again. The count will trouble another mind. Another child will hear there are 7. Another elder will speak as though the missing one has never truly left. Another season will bring frost to the ground, or cold to the air, or the right moment for looking upward and remembering that story can outlast almost everything except the stars themselves. The fire is almost ash now. The candle has shortened. The cold outside has deepened a little. And somewhere beyond the walls, somewhere beyond the ordinary life of the present, the 7 sisters are still climbing above country, still carrying one of humanity's oldest arguments between the eye and remembrance. And if we have listened well tonight, we do not need to force that argument closed. We can leave it where the old people left it, in the sky, in the season, in the count, in the missing light that keeps the story alive. Good night.